the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. We're used to seeing Simone Biles pull off the unthinkable, and she did it again, this time by choosing to withdraw from the world's greatest stage, and in doing so, bringing mental health to center stage.
Just keep making history, Simone Biles.
Here she goes. And there it is!
Other Olympians and athletes are now rallying around Simone Biles' decision to bow out of teams finals in the Tokyo Olympics. It's the latest example of a high-profile celebrity very publicly putting their mental health first.
I say put mental health first because if you don't, then you're not going to enjoy your sport and you're not going to succeed as much as you want to.
This is coming on the heels of tennis star Naomi Osaka's withdrawal from the French Open, also to prioritize her mental well-being. Although they received widespread encouragement, we have seen from some of the reactions that unhelpful attitudes do persist. And they're showing us just how sinister largely white spaces look like for racialized women. In a society that values performance and productivity over humanity and places superhuman expectations on them, Black and racialized women everywhere can relate. Does this mean we're at an important turning point when it comes to dealing with stigmas around speaking out about and focusing on mental health? Did we all need to finally hear it from an Olympian that it's okay to not be okay? The Star's mental health reporter Nadine Yousif wrote about Simone Biles and the significance of all this, and she's here now on This Matters to talk about it. Hi Nadine, it's nice to have you back.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So Nadine, let's start with this. What would it take for an athlete at that top level, at the top of their game, to say, I'm out? Like, how significant is it for someone like Simone Biles to say she's prioritizing her mental health on what's the biggest stage in the world, like the Olympics?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about Simone Biles, she's someone that's trained her entire life for this. She's someone who sacrificed a lot to be at the Olympics, a typical childhood, a normal school experience, prom, all those milestones were pushed aside in the pursuit of that Olympic dream. We also know what she's capable of. Like, we've seen her dominate in the Rio Olympics, winning 4 gold medals. She has 4 moves named after her because she's the first to do them successfully. And she's achieved all of that before the age of 24. So for her to pull back from it all during competition on the Olympic stage is huge because athletes at the end of the day are there to compete and show off years of hard work. Athletes, withdraw from competition due to physical injury all the time. But, what's unprecedented here is that Biles did not have a physical injury. She had a mental health issue and it was her mental health that was suffering. So by stepping back and saying, I can't do this right now because I'm not in the right headspace for it, Biles essentially made a very loud and clear statement that mental health is just as important as physical health. Poor mental health is just as detrimental to her performance as poor physical health. Of course, athletes of that caliber have talked about mental health in the past, namely American swimmer Michael Phelps, who, is the most decorated Olympian in history. But we've never seen it front and center like this during competition.
And we've never seen it sort of take over the main conversation. I mean, we know that psychology already has been at the forefront of these games because of all the extra burdens that athletes are carrying due to COVID and COVID restrictions. But what's really interesting to me is how a lot of athletes have been talking about mental health. It's not just Simone Biles. There's Naomi Osaka. All these Olympians talking about the tremendous psychological stress that these games are causing. So that kind of feels like a shift, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even when Michael Phelps talked about his anxiety, depression, and his struggle with suicidal thoughts, he did so more openly in 2018 after he retired from competing in the Olympics. Talking about mental health at the height of competition, like Biles and Osaka are doing, or Naomi Osaka when she withdrew from the French Open earlier this year, that's what's unprecedented. And the reason is because there's still stigma surrounding mental health in every facet of life, and that includes athletics, where a mental health issue is deemed as a weakness rather than a serious health issue that can be taken care of and treated with the right medical care.
And also, due to the pandemic, there's been a lot of changes over the past 3 years since the last Olympics. And is that possible that this particular time and the way the games are being held under restrictions and without spectators, and a lot of what you would typically see, which would be the comfort zone for these athletes, do you think that's also amplifying the stress and causing a lot of them to speak out as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, putting myself in those athletes' shoes right now, you're in Tokyo under pandemic restrictions, where the city itself is under a state of emergency because of rising COVID-19 cases, and you're afraid of getting sick. You're also unable to hang out and socialize like before. The social aspect was a huge part of the previous Olympics with the Olympic Village, and all of that has sort of diminished. Family isn't there in person to cheer you on, and you're still forced to train and perform at your highest level despite these, unusual circumstances. And, Simone Biles actually talked about that pressure herself, where she said it kind of sucks to feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulder while not having the outlets that you usually would have as an Olympic athlete outside of the pandemic. So, for sure, I think it's having a huge impact on their mental health and their ability to focus.
And when we're talking about Olympic athletes, let's zero in on young female gymnasts. Everyone has high physical demands in this industry, but there's also a sort of performative demand associated with gymnastics. There's a sort of gendered perception that these women should be smiling through it all too. Can you talk to me about some of the challenges Biles would be facing on a daily basis in that context?
Right. So, like I mentioned earlier, Biles won 4 gold medals in Rio when she had just turned 20 years old. And she emerged as this absolute superstar. So the expectation after those Olympics was that she had a lot more to bring to the sport. And when she came to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, she had the expectation that she would become the most decorated gymnast of all time. Now, this is not only her expectation of herself, but also us as spectators thought she would accomplish. Her success has also inspired so many young American women, especially women of color, to take up gymnastics, which is a sport that has traditionally been very white. Her family even started their own gymnastics training gym in Texas as an aftermath of Simone Biles' success. So she's a role model to many people out there who want to achieve what she has achieved. Gymnastics is also a tough sport because it's hyper-focused on an individual's performance. So there's very little room for error. It's also a sport that's extremely dangerous. And one false move can sort of end up an athlete being really hurt and shattering all chances of success. So there's a lot of pressure that Biles likely had to deal with every day for the last 5 years to make sure that she was ready to compete again on the Olympic stage, on top of all the unprecedented challenges that the pandemic itself has brought and the disruptions that has brought on our daily lives.
And on top of that, the US gymnastic team has been a particularly extreme case of what you're talking about. There's been all kinds of incidents of exploitation and abuse over the past few years. How does that play a role in what Biles is going through?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the US Gymnastics Organization has been mired in scandal after the team physician, Dr. Larry Nassar, was convicted of sexually assaulting women and girls on the team over the years. Biles is the only survivor of Nassar's abuse who is still competing at the Olympics. And, she has expressed disappointment before in how USA Gymnastics dealt with the scandal and the abuse and how they failed to protect her and her teammates. We know that sexual assault can be extremely traumatic for survivors, and it can bring to the surface a number of mental health issues and illnesses that need targeted therapy and care. So, it must not have been easy for Biles to still rise above what happened and continue to compete. And, I think she said in the past that she's doing so for the love of the sport and also for the girls and women who look up to her for inspiration. So, yeah, it's tough.
We'll be right back. There's a lot of pressure for sure, and the trauma building up. Also, you talked about public perception. How harmful are the stereotypes that seem to be associated with people's perception of these top athletes? It's considered a space where the best and the toughest are competing for excellence. So in that context, how have people been reacting to these developments of Simone Biles coming out and talking about mental health? And how dangerous are those reactions and those perceptions for female athletes like her?
Right. So, I mean, what's great to see is that most people have been, encouraging and they have supported her. But, some of that has been surprising in the athletic sphere because there is stigma around coming out and saying, I have a mental health issue, I can't compete. It's sort of seen as a weakness. But the biggest harm in that is that we're dismissing a serious health concern that could really hinder an athlete's well-being, both physically and emotionally. When people treat mental health as a choice or as a sign of weakness, it encourages others to keep quiet about whatever they may be experiencing instead of reaching out for help, because there is that genuine fear of being labeled as weak in a hyper environment like the Olympics. The issue is that mental health concerns are valid, and they're as valid as any physical health concern, and ignoring them can be just as detrimental. When it comes to gymnasts especially, there's this thing called the twisties that we've heard a lot about since Simone Biles withdrew from competition, which basically what it means is that it's sort of this feeling where your head and body are not in alignment. And so you're unable to perform full spins in the air with ease while still managing to safely land on your feet. Simone Biles noticed the mental and physical disconnect that she had, and she made the choice by withdrawing from competition because that disconnect can lead to really serious life-threatening injury. Like she could have landed on her ankles and broke them severely, or landed on her neck and injured her spinal cords, all because her head wasn't fully there. And these types of injuries have happened before in the history of gymnastics and are sort of a warning tale to really take care and make sure that you're in tip-top shape when you're competing. And, Biles' decision to put her well-being first could have ultimately saved her life in a way. So it really serves as a reminder that mental health is just as important as anything else for our overall well-being.
So basically what you're saying is she could do some irreversible damage or harm to herself, or even worse potentially, right?
Absolutely.
So we're talking about how there's a different kind of standard and expectation put on athletes' rules, particularly gymnasts as well. But let's also talk about the different kinds of pressure that follows racialized women who achieve in traditionally white, often masculine spaces. And what we saw happening to Simone, to Naomi Osaka before that, did it shed a much needed light on that? And this is not just extended to sports.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talking about women in sports in general, there's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of barriers. Women make less money than male athletes, especially in team environments like the NBA, for example, versus the WNBA. In those environments, they get fewer brand deals and fewer opportunities. They also deal with the expectation from athletes to just be athletes with complete disregard for their humanity and the fact that at the end of the day, they're people too. Like we see achieving extraordinary things, and sometimes we reduce them to their achievements when there's so much more than that. Naomi Osaka isn't just a tennis player, and her job isn't just to dazzle us with her powerful serves. She is also a Black woman who has been outspoken in support of Black Lives Matter last year, and who has used her platform to shed light on police brutality in the United States and elsewhere. But society doesn't take kindly to athletes, especially athletes who are women of color, when they speak up. We sort of expect them to just be grateful to be there. And, these dynamics are just a mirror of what happens outside the arena in other workplaces. These stereotypes play out in all types of workplaces where women of color are expected to remain silent and be grateful for the opportunity to be there. So I think the backlash that Osaka had received by refusing to speak to the media at the French Open and, withdrawing entirely is sort of just a reflection of these stereotypes and barriers that women of color have had to deal with forever.
Yeah, I felt a hard relate. I'm sure if you and I sat down, we'd have plenty of stories to share between the two of us as well, right?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the media here as well. What role has media played in creating these expectations and perceptions? We saw a lot of prominent people that have been critical, like Piers Morgan accusing her of walking out on her team and saying that mental health is now going to be the go-to excuse for poor performance. And similar problematic columns have been written here as well. And also we've seen what Naomi Osaka dealt with in the aftermath of her withdrawal from the French Open. And that was also because of anxiety related to the media. So what has that shown us about the lens through which racialized female athletes are perceived? And yes, I did sort of use a pun there.
Yes, yes. What's interesting is that the way that the media reacts to these things is, again, sort of shows us these rigid stereotypes that we're trying to sort of overcome as a society and as women of color. These things are mirrored in the way that, in the backlash that Osaka has received, and even some of Pierre Morgan's comments about Simone Biles. When Osaka refused to compete in the French Open, and, she did so because she was fined for sitting out the post-media press conferences, media quickly turned on her and painted her as someone who was unprofessional. And that is, a lot of it is just plain old racism and stereotypes rearing its ugly head in the world of sports. Instead of asking ourselves why Osaka refused to speak to the media and reflecting on her reasoning, the media instead vilified her. And it's harmful because we expect athletes to just take it, because they're athletes and they're extraordinary in so many ways. But in many other ways, they're human. And what Osaka and Biles reminded us is that, they do pay attention to what is said and written. And, we should be reflecting within ourselves as the media industry and how we've been harming athletes in our word choices and our coverage, and how we can be more compassionate and not peddle, age-old stereotypes through the media and put that on the back of these athletes.
So do you think this will help in losing some of the stigma that comes with talking openly about mental health, especially for racialized women as they battle damaging stereotypes and various other barriers?
Yes, I do think that this will help us lose some of that stigma. As much as we saw harmful comments from Piers Morgan and other columnists, we've also seen so much support. I mean, unprecedented support. We're also in an era of renewed focus on mental health. Part of that has to do with the pandemic. Well, part of that has to do with us coming to terms with issues that were always there to begin with. And it's not just athletes, We have Meghan Markle speaking out earlier this year about her mental health and shedding light on these issues within the royal family that were not previously talked about. Those are some really high-profile conversations that have actually been met with a lot of understanding and compassion. I mean, we're sitting here today talking about the bravery of these women and their ability to put their mental health first and to rise above it and remind us that it's okay for us to do the same. So I do feel like there's a shift, both in athletics and elsewhere. And I really commend these women for coming forward and bringing those issues to the spotlight.
And such an important time too during this pandemic. I feel like this moment has transcended sports in a way. And there's a lot that can be taken away from this, seeing that if an Olympian can struggle with stress and prioritize mental health, we can take some meaning, in terms of more normalizing this in our work, in our lives, because it has been a very tough generational trauma that all of us have undergone during this pandemic, right?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, the pandemic has kind of made us realize that mental health affects all of us in some way or another. Some of us are struggling with anxiety or depression or other mental illnesses, or know someone who has. Mental illnesses like eating disorders have also worsened during the pandemic. But, they were always there. And some of us will continue struggling with our mental health long after the pandemic is over. So the lessons that are learned here and what's important that we take away from this is the importance of paying attention to our minds as much as we do to our bodies, and allowing ourselves the space and grace to heal from any mental health issue that we may be facing as much as we would do with, let's say, like a twisted ankle. Like Simone Biles, you're allowed to put your mental health first, and not doing so will hinder your overall well-being. So it's important that we as the public are mindful of that employers, outside the arena are mindful of that, and to start taking these issues as seriously as any other health issue.
Thank you so much, Nadine. This has been such an insightful and helpful conversation. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
I was talking to the Star's mental health reporter, Nadine Yousif. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mudhar, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.